dream is how his vision of the beloved community found expression on a national level. New South is how that vision found expression on a regional level.
Very good. Of course, we're going to get ready for this second commercial break, Dr. Baldwin, and then we'll come back for the final segment. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Once again. Okay, thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's giving us some information in reference to Dr. Martin Luther King and the Beloved community. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let's see if we can pick up during this final segment. We've got about 10 minutes to give you an opportunity to review some of the information that you gave us earlier and bring it into the final part of this show, however you wish to bring it to our audience this morning with all the knowledge that you have.
Yes, I think it's important to realize that Dr. King's dream of community was a lifelong dream. When he was 6 years old, he lost a white playmate because of racism. The little white boy's father didn't want him to play with King. And I've always argued in my scholarship that King's search for the beloved community actually begins before he's educated. But what I've said so far indicates how he began to articulate that concept of the beloved community on an intellectual level. First, by looking at New South from 1954 to 1960. Secondly, the American Dream from 1960 to 1964. And finally, in the final 3 years of Dr. King's life, of course, we must remember that he received the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1964. And the final 3 years of his life, from 65 to 68, he's devoted to the realization of what he called the world house. And that's the third level that we need to consider when we talk about his conception of the beloved community. New South, American Dream, World House.
And moving the American dream.
That's
upward.
right.
Is that,
and World House, of course, in the last book he wrote, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Dr. King said that we live in a world house. The world has become so small because of scientific and technological revolutions. We can travel anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. There's information technology. We can talk to people by telephone. And because the world has become so small, we live in a world house or a worldwide neighborhood. And we need to do what? Try to fight against global poverty, global racism, and war, which he considered to be barriers to the realization of the world house. But we are part of a world house, and this is what globalization scholars are saying today. When you look at what's going on around the world, Dr. King said as far back as 1967 that what goes on in other parts of the world impacts the quality of life for Americans.
That's his attitude in reference to the Vietnam War and all of those things.
Right.
That had a real,
That's right.
Not only had an impact there, but it had an impact here.
That's right. When he spoke against the Vietnam War, when he spoke against South African apartheid, when he spoke out against poverty and racism on a global scale, war in general, he was talking about threats to the realization of the world house. God has made all humans of the world, irrespective of religion and politics, racial and ethnic identities. We are all a part of the creation of one God. And we must realize that we are bound together by this act of creation. And that we need to learn to live together as brothers and sisters, irrespective of our differences. And this is where he was coming from around this conception of the world house. And I might point out that what I've said so far about the New South, the American Dream, the world house, Dr. King embodied that in his own personal progression, because he moved from being a little-known Southern Black Baptist preacher to a national figure, and ultimately a world figure.
And so the monument on the mall in Washington, D.C. of Dr. Martin Luther King is a realization in terms of art, in terms of the world dream that the world house that Dr. King envisioned.
It's a depiction of that vision, this image of the world house that he was talking about, because you know that a Chinese architect was heavily involved in the creation of that monument. I think Dr. King would be proud, because people from all over the world, I think yesterday, a day before yesterday, Prince Charles from England visited the King Monument in Washington, D.C. So what that monument means, of course, is that people from all over the world can come and celebrate the memory of Dr. King and be exposed to some of his statements. I don't know if you've been to that monument, but if you walk around, there are quotes from Dr. King on the walls. And for people across the world to be exposed to that, I think is phenomenal.
Dr. Baldwin, before we've got about 3 or 4 more minutes. But before we leave today, let's look at the threat to this world house that is current today. When you look around the world, you see what is going on in Yemen, and what is going on in Syria, and what is going on in terms of efforts to destroy antiquity in a real sense. The world. Speak to that over the last few minutes that we have.
You couldn't have asked a better question, because I think Dr. King's vision of the world house is threatened today. We talk about ISIS and what's going on in parts of Syria and Iraq and other parts of the world. You can also talk about global poverty, which extends into this country as well. You can talk about racism. You can talk about religious bigotry and intolerance, which figures into the Middle East crisis and so many other crises, even in this country where Islamophobia is a major problem. So you're right in saying that there are still barriers to be overcome in terms of the full actualization of what Dr. King had in mind when he spoke of this world house. Because the world house means that we are able to transcend these differences and to become one as brothers and sisters, irrespective of color and other artificial barriers. But there are challenges, there are problems, there are struggles that rest ahead in terms of our ability to really complete the unfinished agenda of Dr. King's Holy Crusade as it related to what? World community and world peace.
And that ought to be an example as to how leaders of all over the world ought to be working toward that kind of idea. And I think I was really encouraged by some of the things that President Obama said when he was able to assemble all of those folks together in terms of a realization and a real sense of what? The house, the full house.
Yes, I think so much of what President Obama is involved in today is a reflection of what Dr. King had in mind. The Iran talks with Iran, peace talks, the efforts to resolve the crisis in the Middle East, the efforts to deal with the HIV crisis around the world and other diseases. President Obama is involved in that, and he's talked a lot about globalization. And this is what Dr. King talked about, the globalization of an ethical ideal, the globalization of peace, the globalization of a communitarian ideal is what Dr. King had in mind. And interestingly enough, I'll end on this, Dr. King's birthday is celebrated in over 100 countries. Celebrated, recognized. And I think that too speaks to the impact of his global vision.
And so Dr. King was an unusual individual, but he also inspired other individuals to move forward and to move beyond the American dream into the full house.
The world house.
World house. Everybody's
from the New South to the American dream to the world house.
Yeah. And if our leaders could buy into that idea, no matter what political party they might be in, how they might vote, and et cetera, if they could subscribe to that idea, we would have, you believe, to be a better world.
The realization of Dr. King's beloved community vision on all levels.
And that makes Dr. King